Everyone loves a company picnic until the parking lot goes dead silent. When my boss leaned in and told me I'd be cleaning out my locker unless I let his 23-year-old black belt son win a bare-knuckle exhibition, he didn't realize the quiet inventory manager he'd just threatened had spent 10 years as a Navy SEAL clearing rooms in places that don't officially exist. What happened next took exactly one takedown. For 3 years, I kept my head down at DeLuca Wholesale, managing inventory and letting my boss Frank treat me like a man with no other choices. He never asked what I did before I traded a rifle for a clipboard, and I never offered it. That silence was my shield. But when Frank cornered me and told me to lose a bare-knuckle fight to his 23-year-old black belt son, Mason, or clear out my locker by Monday, he mistook my stillness for weakness. He didn't know that inside a quiet warehouse supervisor, a decade of Navy SEAL combat training was just waiting to be uncaged, and the picnic was only 3 days away. Those 3 days felt like the longest inventory count of my life. Every time I walked to the warehouse floor, I caught Frank DeLuca watching me with a smile that never reached his eyes. He had run DeLuca Wholesale for 22 years, and he ruled it less like a manager and more like a petty king. He called it a family business, but the only family that mattered was his son. Mason was 23 years old, a black belt from a strip mall dojo, and the most dangerous ego I had ever seen outside a war zone. Before I took this job, I spent 10 years as a Navy SEAL. Most of that time was spent in places that do not officially exist. I cleared rooms in Fallujah, Ramadi, and a few locations the government still will not acknowledge. I learned to read threats the way other men read spreadsheets. When I came home, I wanted exactly one thing: silence. I changed my address, stopped talking about the old days, and buried my skills so deep I sometimes convinced myself they were gone. But DeLuca Wholesale did not want silence. It wanted hierarchy. And at the top of that hierarchy sat a 23-year-old black belt who treated the shipping floor like his personal dojo. Mason had a sneer that never left his face, the kind that told you he had been told his whole life he was special. He would walk through the warehouse in expensive gym clothes, shadowboxing between pallets, slapping boxes out of workers' hands. He once shoved a forklift driver named Eddie into a steel rack because Eddie did not move fast enough. When Eddie complained to Frank, Frank told him to stop provoking his son. That was company policy. For 2 years, I avoided Mason. Not because I was afraid, but because I had sworn I would never be the man I used to be. I blended in. I kept my head down, spoke only when asked, and if Mason ever looked my way, I made sure I was already moving toward the exit. But predators can smell avoidance. Mason had been circling me for months. It happened on a Tuesday. I had finished logging a shipment of bathroom fixtures and walked into the break room to grab a cup of coffee. Mason's gym bag was on the floor, right behind the door. I did not see it. My boot caught the strap, and the bag slid maybe 3 inches. That was all. Mason was at the vending machine. He turned, stared at me, then stepped directly into my path. His nostrils flared. He waited for me to flinch. Instead, I said, "Sorry about the bag." No trembling, no excuse. Just the exact wrong response for a man like him. To a narcissist, calm is an insult. He leaned in close enough that I could smell his energy drink and whatever aggression he had been marinating in all morning. "You'll be sorry for more than that," he said, then poked my chest with 2 fingers. I did not move. He laughed, said he would see me around, and walked out. I stood there and finished my coffee. The next morning, Frank called me into his office. He had that same smile, the one that said he had already won. He told me the company picnic was on Saturday and that he had arranged something special to boost morale. A friendly exhibition, me versus Mason. In the parking lot, bare knuckle, no gloves, no pads, no referee, just 2 men in a circle of pallets. Then he leaned in close enough that I could smell old coffee and cheap cologne. "Listen, I like you," he said. "You're quiet, you do your job. But here's the thing. My boy Mason, he's got a reputation. He's been training his whole life. That black belt means something. In this exhibition, it's not about who wins. It's about making him look good. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to step in that circle, and you're going to take a dive. You go down in the first minute, make it look real, and you keep your job. You don't, and Monday morning you can clean out your locker." I nodded. I did not argue. I did not tell him what I had been before I put on the clipboard. I just said, "Understood." and walked out. That was my first mistake, because once a man like Frank DeLuca thinks you have no options, he will push until he finds your limit. That night, I sat in my apartment and stared at a box of old medals I had not opened in years. I had spent 10 years being a weapon. I had told myself I was retired, but Frank had just made one thing clear. My silence was not peace. It was permission. And I was done giving permission to bullies. I did not train. I did not stretch. I updated my resume for the first time in 3 years and booked a meeting with a staffing agency for Monday morning. I was not planning to lose. I was planning to be ready either way. But when Saturday arrived, I put on my work boots and an old polo shirt and drove to the picnic like a man with nothing left to prove. The company picnic was exactly what Frank wanted. Hot dogs on a folding table, a boombox playing classic rock, and a ring of shipping pallets arranged in the parking lot like a crude cage. Mason was already there, bouncing on his toes, tapping his fists together. He was wearing black shorts and a black tank top with his dojo's logo. When he saw me, he grinned, cupped his hands around his mouth, and shouted, "Don't worry, old man, I'll make it quick." The employees gathered in a loose circle, phones out, half of them smiling, half of them looking like they wanted to call someone. Frank stood by the grill, arms crossed, looking like a man about to watch his son win a trophy. I stepped into the circle. My boots crunched on the asphalt. Mason kept bouncing. Then somebody hit the bell they had rigged from a forklift horn. Mason lunged, and for the first time in 3 years, my body did not ask permission. The forklift horn blast had barely faded when Mason launched himself at me. He didn't lead with a jab, didn't test my range. He went straight for a spinning back kick, the same flashy move that had made him a legend in his own mind. His hips turned, his heel whipped toward my ribs, and for one split second, the crowd gasped. But to me, it was like watching a man throw a punch underwater. I saw the shift in his weight, the opening under his arm, the exact spot where his balance was weakest. My body didn't ask permission. I stepped forward into the spin, caught his leg at the ankle, and drove the heel of my palm into his sternum. The impact was short, brutal, and completely without drama. Mason's eyes went wide just before he left the ground. He hit the asphalt flat on his back with a sound like a side of beef dropped from a truck. The crowd went from cheering to frozen in less than a second. For a moment, nobody moved. Mason lay there blinking at the sky, his chest heaving, his mouth opening and closing like he had forgotten how to breathe. I stayed exactly where I was, hands loose at my sides, and watched him. It would have been easy to end it there, but Mason had been building toward this his whole life, and a man like that doesn't stay down from a single fall. He rolled to his side, coughed, and scrambled to his feet. The sneer was gone, replaced by something uglier. Humiliation had burned away every trace of discipline he ever had. His face was purple, his fists were trembling, and he came at me again without a plan. He threw a wild right cross, then a left hook meant for my liver, then a front kick aimed at my knee. I didn't back up. I didn't raise my hands into a guard. I shifted an inch one way, a half inch the other, letting his own momentum drag him past me. Each miss made him angrier. Each miss made the crowd lean closer. They had all seen Mason bully forklift drivers and mock the custodians. They had all watched Frank defend his son, but now the impossible thing was happening in front of them, and nobody wanted to blink. Mason stepped back, breathing hard, and did what every bully finally does when the ground shifts. He tried to rush me. He lowered his head and charged like a bar fighter, arms reaching for my waist. That was when I saw Frank's face. He had stepped to the edge of the pallet circle, his arms no longer crossed, his jaw no longer smug. His expression wasn't just shock, it was rage so pure it looked like fear, because this was never about a friendly exhibition. Frank had spent 22 years building a company where his son was untouchable. Every worker in that parking lot had learned to lower their eyes when Mason passed. Every complaint had been buried under Frank's influence. If I won, that fear died in front of everyone, and Frank DeLuca would lose the only power he actually understood. Mason's shoulder hit my midsection, and I absorbed the charge the way I had absorbed worse in Fallujah. I stepped backward with the momentum, then changed the angle and used his own weight against him. My left hand caught his wrist as he tried to wrap me up. My right arm slid across his back. I didn't throw him. I flowed him into the ground, twisting the wrist into a lock that sent a sharp current of pain through his arm and shoulder. He screamed. Not the controlled yell of a fighter, but the high, piercing shriek of a man who had never felt real pain before. I pinned him face down on the asphalt, his arm torqued behind his back, his cheek pressed against the gravel, his legs kicking uselessly at the air. The crowd was dead silent. Somewhere behind me, a plastic fork fell from someone's hand and clattered on the pavement. Frank took one step into the circle. His voice was low and shaking with fury. "Let him go. That's my son." I didn't loosen the grip. I looked down at Mason, whose breath was coming in quick, panicked gasps, and I said the only words I needed to say. "The only reason you're walking away is because I chose to let you." Then I stood, released his wrist, and stepped back. Mason didn't move. He stayed on the ground, clutching his arm, staring at the asphalt like he had just discovered gravity for the first time. I looked once at Frank, then turned and walked through the crowd toward my truck. No one tried to stop me. No one even spoke. I picked up my cooler from the ground, opened the driver's side door, and slid behind the wheel. The engine turned over as smoothly as ever. I put the truck in gear, and just before I pulled out of the lot, I heard Frank's voice rise above the silence. "You just threw away your life, Callahan. You hear me? You are done." I didn't look back. I didn't know yet that the real fight was just beginning. On Monday morning, I pulled into the employee lot at 7:10 a.m., exactly as I had for 3 years. The gate opened when I scanned my badge. That was the first sign something was wrong, because Frank had texted me Sunday night that my badge would be deactivated. It wasn't. Frank wanted me inside. I parked in my usual spot, grabbed my lunch bag from the passenger seat, and walked toward the warehouse entrance. The air felt heavier than usual. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed over the shipping floor, but the usual early morning clatter of forklifts was muted. I saw Eddie, the forklift driver Mason had shoved, standing by the dock doors. He caught my eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then he looked away. Before I reached the time clock, 2 security guards stepped into my path. They didn't say a word. They simply escorted me toward the front office, past the reception desk where one of the clerks pretended to be very interested in a clipboard. Frank DeLuca was waiting in the conference room, seated at the head of the long table, like a man holding court. His lawyer, a thin man with a briefcase and a bad suit, sat on his right. Mason was nowhere to be seen, which told me he was either still recovering or too embarrassed to show his face. Frank stood when I entered. "You're done," he said, his voice tight with rehearsed anger. "Effective immediately. Security will escort you to clean out your locker. And if you think this is over, you're wrong. I'm pressing charges for assault and battery. You attacked my son in front of witnesses. You're going to jail." I set my lunch bag on the table, slowly, and looked at him, with the kind of quiet that used to make men in Fallujah lower their weapons. "Frank," I said, "you should hear something before you make this worse." I pulled out my phone and opened an audio file. Then I pressed play. The recording filled the room. It was his voice from the meeting 3 days earlier, every syllable crisp and unmistakable. "You're going to take a dive. You go down in the first minute, make it look real, and you keep your job. You don't, and Monday morning you can clean out your locker." There was a pause, then my own voice saying, "Understood." I stopped the playback. Frank's lawyer went still. Frank's face shifted through 3 shades of red before settling on a pale, splotchy white. "That's illegal wiretapping," he spat. "I'll have you locked up for that alone." I shook my head. "One-party consent state, Frank, and I didn't wiretap anything. You were talking to me. I just happened to be recording." The lawyer cleared his throat, but Frank waved him off. He wasn't done. "You think a recording matters? I've got the sheriff on my personal contact list. I've got employees who saw you slam my son into the ground. You're a violent ex-military psycho who forgot how to behave in civilization. You're finished." I didn't argue. I just reached into my back pocket and pulled out a folded manila envelope. Inside were printed statements from 7 employees, including Eddie, describing years of Mason's violent behavior and Frank's threats to keep them quiet. I had collected them over the past 3 years, not because I planned to use them, but because old habits die hard. I never threw away evidence. I slid the envelope across the table. These are copies, I said. The originals are with a reporter I know from my service days. She's been looking for a story about workplace intimidation and corporate cover-ups. I gave her the full picture yesterday. So if I were you, I'd start thinking about how this looks on the evening news, not how to get me arrested. Frank's lips moved, but no sound came out. The security guards shifted their weight. The lawyer looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Then Frank did something I didn't expect. He laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound, the laugh of a man who had been fighting for power his whole life and refused to lose. You think the news cares about a warehouse manager? You think anyone will believe a washed-up SEAL over a respected business owner? I've been here 22 years. I've donated to every local charity, sponsored Little League teams, given speeches at the Chamber of Commerce. You're nobody. He was right about one thing. In this town, Frank DeLuca had spent 2 decades buying influence. The sheriff's department had been to his summer barbecues. The mayor had attended his grand opening. But Frank forgot one detail. Influence only works when the people protecting you aren't also afraid of what you've done. At 9 o'clock that morning, 2 uniformed officers arrived. They didn't arrest me immediately. They asked questions, listened to Frank's side, listened to mine, then looked at the video footage from the picnic that someone had already posted online. It showed Mason attacking first with a spinning kick. It showed me defending myself with 1 takedown. The officers exchanged a glance, then told Frank they would need to review the evidence. Frank's face went rigid. He had expected them to cuff me on the spot. Instead, they asked me to come to the station voluntarily for a statement. I agreed. That afternoon, I sat in a small interview room for 2 hours while a detective took notes. I told him everything. The threat, the extortion, the fight, the aftermath. I handed over a thumb drive with the recording and the witness statements. By 5 o'clock, I walked out without charges. But Frank wasn't done. He called the company's corporate office and claimed I had threatened him with a gun. That was a mistake, because the next morning the real inquiry began. The parent company, a national logistics firm that had acquired DeLuca Wholesale 4 years earlier, sent a regional HR manager and a corporate investigator. They arrived unannounced just as Frank was berating Eddie in front of the loading dock for not lying to the police. That was the moment the whole thing flipped. The investigator, a woman named Diane Reyes, walked onto the floor and asked to see Frank's personnel files. Frank refused. She asked again, this time with the company's chief legal counsel on speakerphone. Frank's face lost all color. He had spent years hiding his dealings from corporate, assuming the local branch was too small to audit. He had been wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation peeled back layer after layer. They found that Frank had been embezzling from the company by creating fake vendor accounts. The money went to pay for Mason's martial arts training, his luxury car, his custom black belts, even the dojo's rent. They found that Frank had covered up at least 4 prior incidents where Mason had injured employees, settling quietly with cash and threats. They found safety reports that had been falsified after Eddie's accident. And then they found something that made the national news. Buried in Frank's office was a file on me. He had known about my military background for over a year since I applied for the job. He had deliberately hired me, thinking a former operator would be too broken to fight back, but he had underestimated what broken men can rebuild. The file was filled with notes about my weaknesses, my aversion to conflict, my desire for anonymity. He thought he had found the perfect target. He was wrong. The night the story broke, I sat in my apartment watching the local news. The anchor was talking about a veteran who had been forced to defend himself against a workplace bully, and how the real villain was the boss who had spent years covering up his son's violence. The video of the fight had gone viral, not just locally but nationally. Mason's face was everywhere, a symbol of arrogant martial artists who confused belts with actual combat. Frank was placed on administrative leave and then terminated. He was arrested on embezzlement and witness tampering charges. Mason was charged with assault for the previous incidents and barred from teaching minors. But here's the thing about men like Frank. Even when they lose, they don't go quietly. 3 weeks after my resignation, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a private investigator working for Frank's attorney. He said Frank wanted to offer me a settlement to drop any civil claims and to sign a non-disclosure agreement. The number was substantial, enough to keep me comfortable for years. I asked one question: what does Frank want more than the money? The investigator paused, then said, he wants you to disappear and never speak about this again. I told him I'd think about it. That night, I walked through the warehouse one last time, packing the last of my personal items. Eddie was there, loading a truck, and he stopped me. They offered me a settlement too, he said. I'm taking it, but I wanted you to know what you did changed everything for the rest of us. He shook my hand, and I could see the relief in his eyes. Frank's kingdom had fallen, not because I was a trained fighter, but because a group of people finally stopped being afraid. I didn't take Frank's settlement. I didn't need his money. I had already accepted a job with an old teammate who ran a security consulting firm, doing threat assessments for corporate clients. It paid well, kept me in the world I knew, and never asked me to throw a punch. But before I left for good, there was one final piece of the story I didn't expect, and it changed how I saw the entire fight. 2 weeks after I turned down the settlement, my phone rang with a local number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in my gut told me to pick up. The voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper, and it took me a second to recognize it. It was Mason DeLuca. I know you don't owe me anything, he said, but I need to tell you something. Not because I want anything from you, just because you're the only person who ever made it stop. I listened. He told me about the day his mother died when he was 7. Frank had been driving them home from a tournament, drunk, and he rolled the car into a ditch. Mason's mother was in the passenger seat. She didn't survive. Frank never went to jail because the sheriff at the time was his cousin. From that night on, Frank poured everything into Mason. Not love, but expectation. Mason was going to be a champion. He was going to be the legacy his mother never got to see. If Mason refused to train, Frank would lock him in the basement. If Mason lost a match, Frank would ignore him for weeks. If Mason showed fear, Frank would hit him hard enough to leave bruises, always where no one would see. He didn't want me to fight you because he thought I'd win, Mason said. He wanted me to fight you because he wanted to watch me hurt someone the way he felt hurt. He wanted proof that I was as broken as him. When you threw me down, it wasn't humiliation. It was the first time I ever felt like I could stop being his weapon. That was the final piece. Not a legal twist or a hidden agenda. The surprising detail was simpler and harder. Mason had been a victim too, wearing a black belt-like armor over a child who never had a chance to say no. The fight in the parking lot wasn't just a former SEAL dismantling a bully. It was a fatherless kid finally learning that someone else could break the chain without becoming a monster. The call lasted 40 minutes. I didn't say much. I let him talk. At the end, he said, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just saying thank you for not killing me and for not letting him win. Then he hung up. I sat there for a long time, looking at the wall, realizing that the man I had dropped onto the asphalt was not the enemy. He was just the loudest symptom of a much older disease. Frank DeLuca's trial began in late November. He faced 3 counts of embezzlement, 2 counts of witness tampering, and 1 count of extortion. The prosecutor used my recording as the centerpiece of the case, playing it for the jury 3 times. Each time, Frank's face twitched like a man watching himself in a nightmare. Eddie and 4 other employees testified about years of threats and abuse. The defense tried to paint me as a violent ex-soldier with a grudge, but the video from the picnic showed the truth. Mason attacked first. I responded with exactly 1 takedown. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes before returning guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Frank to 8 years in federal prison and ordered restitution to the company and the employees he had cheated. Frank DeLuca left the courtroom in handcuffs, no longer the king of anything. Mason pleaded guilty to 2 misdemeanor assault charges for the prior incidents. Because of his cooperation against his father, the judge gave him probation and mandatory counseling. He was also banned from teaching martial arts to minors for 5 years. I saw the hearing from the back of the room. He did not look over at me, but as he walked out, he paused at the door and gave the smallest nod. I nodded back. The company, after the investigation, made real changes. The warehouse was placed under new management, and they hired a safety coordinator who actually reported to corporate, not to the local boss. Eddie was promoted to shift supervisor, and he told me the first thing he did was remove the pallet circle from the parking lot. "We don't need a fight ring," he said. "We need a break area with chairs that don't smell like old diesel." I laughed. It was the first real laugh I had allowed myself in years. As for me, I started the new job with my old teammate's firm. It was a quiet office in an industrial park, nothing glamorous, but the work was honest. I ran background checks, wrote threat assessments, and occasionally walked clients through active shooter drills. I did not carry a weapon, I did not need one. The muscle memory was still there, but I had learned something important. The most effective weapon I ever had was not my hands, not my training, not even the video. It was the willingness to stay calm, document everything, and let the truth do the fighting. I never spoke to Frank again. I didn't need to. The last image I have of him is from the sentencing, his wrists in cuffs, his shoulders slumped, his eyes searching the gallery for someone to blame. He found no one, not me, not Mason, not Eddie, just the consequences of his own choices. Finally caught up with him. And here's the part I still think about on quiet nights, when the old dreams come back. For 10 years, I was trained to kill. I was trained to neutralize threats with minimum force and maximum efficiency. But the fight at the picnic wasn't the real battle. The real battle was fought with patience, with evidence, with the decision not to become the monster Frank wanted me to be. I could have ended Mason in that parking lot. I could have sent him to the hospital with a broken arm and a shattered ego. But I chose not to, and that choice changed everything. Because sometimes the strongest punch you can throw is the one you hold back. The video of the fight still circulates online. People watch it and cheer for the quiet dad in work boots who shut down the young black belt. They see a moment of victory, but they don't see the 3 years of silent documentation, the 7 co-workers who risked their jobs to tell the truth, the long nights of wondering if I was doing the right thing. They see one punch. They don't see the years of preparation that made that one punch possible. A month after the trial, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 words written in careful, almost childlike handwriting. "Thank you. I'm free now." I never found out if it was from Mason or someone else in the warehouse, but I kept it, folded inside my old flannel shirt pocket, as a reminder that freedom takes many forms. The company picnic had been Frank's idea, but it became the end of his kingdom. The employees who had once lowered their eyes now looked his son in the face and saw not a predator, but a prisoner finally released. The parking lot where I dropped a black belt onto the asphalt became the place where a decade of fear started to crack. And in the weeks that followed, as the truth came out and the old order collapsed, the warehouse fell silent one last time. Not with fear, but with something that felt almost like relief. I am not a hero. I am just a man who kept his head down until keeping it down became a choice to let a bully win. If there is one thing I want people to take from this story, it is that the most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest, not the strongest, not the one with the black belt or the badge. It is the one who has been paying attention, who has been patient, and who has finally decided that enough is enough. The fight in the parking lot was never about me versus Mason. It was about what happens when someone stops being afraid to stand up. And when I drove home that afternoon, I wasn't updating my resume because I was defeated. I was updating it because I had already won. That's the story. The hook said one takedown. The truth was one decision. The decision to remain calm, to let the evidence speak, and to walk away without needing to prove anything to a man whose entire empire was built on fear. And in the end, Frank DeLuca learned what every bully eventually learns. The silence you use to control people is the same silence that will bury you when they finally find their voice. Here is what I wish more people understood. The fight was never the point. The point is what led to it. For 3 years, I kept my head down because I thought survival meant staying invisible. I was wrong. Survival meant staying prepared. It meant documenting every threat, keeping every record, and building a case even when I hoped I would never need it. That quiet preparation was the real weapon, and it is available to anyone. The irony is that Frank DeLuca spent his entire life perfecting the art of control through fear. He controlled his son, his employees, his public image. But fear is fragile. The moment one person refused to be afraid, the entire architecture began to crumble. Mason found freedom, Eddie found a voice, the company found a backbone, and Frank found a prison cell. This does not just happen in warehouses. It happens in boardrooms, in gyms, in churches, in families. Somewhere right now, a loudmouth with a little power is testing the silence of the people around him. He is waiting to see who will flinch. If everyone flinches, he wins. But if even one person keeps calm and keeps records, the math changes. I used to think the opposite of war was silence. Now I understand the opposite of violence is not peace. It is accountability. And accountability requires ordinary people to stop looking away. It requires the patience to collect evidence, the discipline to control your own anger, and the wisdom to know that some battles are won not with your hands, but with the truth. So the question is not whether you could win a bare-knuckle fight in a parking lot. The question is whether you are already preparing to win a fight you hope never happens. And if you are not, what is stopping you? But here is the part that still stays with me. It is not the sound of Mason hitting the asphalt or the look on Frank's face when the verdict came down. It is the silence that preceded all of it. I was the one who had trained to handle danger. And if I stayed quiet for 3 years, what chance did anyone else have? That thought humbles me even now. If this story made you think differently about what real strength looks like, hit that like button so more people see it. Share it with someone who needs to hear that bullies can fall. Subscribe for more stories about the moment ordinary people stopped accepting the unacceptable. And in the comments, tell us about a time you saw someone finally stand their ground. We read them. Until next time, stay calm, stay prepared, and never let fear write your ending.